Alright, today we're going to do points, lines, and planes, so let's get started with some definitions. The first one is what is a postulate, and it is a statement given without any justification. So a statement given without any justification. And the reason why I'm covering that is because we're going to start talking about some postulates. A point has no dimension. I can't really prove to you what a point is, so it's pretty much something given to you without any justification. So a point has no dimension. It's usually represented with a dot and a capital letter. A dot and a capital letter. So for example, it would look like this, and I have it right there on your screen for you. That would be point A right there. And when you name the point, you would just say A. So if I said, list the point on this page, you would just write A. You don't have to write the word point in front of it. If you do, it's fine, but you don't have to do that. So you're just doing extra work. The next thing we talk about is a line. Okay, and a line has one dimension. So a line only has one dimension. And it's going to extend without end in both of those directions. The one thing that people forget a lot, and they have to remember, is that a line will have an arrow at both ends. I'll have students that leave those arrows off, and if you leave them off, it's a completely different thing. So make sure that when you're drawing a line, you do put an arrow at both ends. So let's look at this line that's on the screen right here. So this line right here has a lot of things going on. I see a couple of points, I see this random cursive letter at the end, and there's a lot of different ways you could name this line. So let's go ahead and read through this part. You can name this line multiple ways, but you must make sure to have the right notation, so be careful. You can only name a line by using 2 points, and I'll talk about that in a second. And if you see a letter at the end of the line, this guy right here, usually a cursive one, then that isn't a point at all. And so there are some names that you could give to this line, and let's go through them. You can only use 2 letters, so you could call this line AB. And when you're doing this, you actually have to draw the notation above it. So AB would be one of your answers. You also could say BA with this notation above it. You could call this line AC with the notation above it. You could also call it line CA with that notation. You could call it line BC with that notation above it. You can flip-flop those letters there. So hopefully you're seeing there's a lot of different ways I can name this line. Let's talk about what we do with this little letter here at the end, though. If you see that letter at the end, it's not a point. That's actually a name for the line. So you could also just call this line L. So all of those would be the exact same line, and they would all be correct if you had to name it. All right, let's keep going. Let's talk about planes. A plane has 2 dimensions. 2 dimensions. It's represented by a shape that looks like a wall or floor, but imagine everything extends without end. So let's look at this picture right here. It looks like a little square, a rhombus, or something like that. Just imagine that these edges are going on forever. So that would be a plane. You can name a plane multiple ways, but if you name it using points, you have to use 3 points. So unlike the line, which uses 2, you have to use 3 points for a plane. If you see a letter that's not a point, which is usually tucked into the corner, you can name it by this letter 2. So let's talk about all the different names we could give this plane. So do you see this little letter down here in the corner? It's kind of tucked away. So I could call this plane P. Okay, since that's not a point, that's a name. I could also call it plane ABC. I also could call it plane CBA, BCA, BAC. You could scramble up these 3 letters as long as you use 3 letters. You can't call it something like, if you say like it's plane AB, that would be wrong. You have to have at least 3 letters, okay? So it's a little different than line. 3 letters for a plane, 2 letters for a line. All right, let's keep going. So the next thing that we're going to cover are collinear points. These are all points on the same, look at this word, collinear. So there's a word inside of here you should already have seen before, which is line. So they are points all on the same line. Now if they ask you for non-collinear points, this means that they would not be on the same line. So non means not, which is important because let's look at this next one, coplanar points. So points on the same, what word do you see in here? plane. So points on the same plane. Now, non-coplanar means they are not all on the same plane. So non means not. Coplanar means on the same plane. Down here with coplanar lines, lines that are on the same plane. Lines that are on the same plane. And non-coplanar means that the lines are not on the same plane. All right? So if you just look at the word and kind of break down what's going on inside of it, that might make it a little easier for you to answer the question. So let's do a couple of things with these new words down here. So it says list the following. First thing, we have to list all the points in the picture. Now, a lot of students will mess this up because they're going to list J and K as a point, but neither of these are points. Notice they don't have a dot next to them. They're actually names of the plane, okay? So you don't want to list those as points. So it looks like to me T, U, S, and W are the only points in this picture. T, U, S, and W. Now they want 3 collinear points, so points on the same line. So the 3 points that are on the same line here in this picture would be T, U, and S. Now let's talk about 2 different lines that are in the picture. Name 2 lines. Well, it might be hard to see one of them, but one of them is right here. It's kind of sneaky. It's in between these 2 planes. And I don't see any points on it, so I have to call this line L. Now we have a second line here, this one right here, and we could call it a lot of different names. We could call this line N. We could call it line TU. We can call it line US. We can call it line TS. There's a lot of options here. Since it has that little N on it though, and I'm kind of lazy, I'm just going to call it line N. Okay? But there are a lot of names for that and they would all be right. All right, it also says to name 2 planes. Well, looking over here, I don't have 3 points on this plane, so I would not be able to label it by its points. However, in the corner, there's a letter. So I can call this plane K. And the second plane is over here. This does have 3 points, so I could call this plane TUS or plane SUT or plane UTS, etc., right? As long as I use these 3 points, I could call it that plane. But I'm kind of lazy and I notice there's this little letter in the corner. I'm just going to call it plane J. And then the last thing here that they're asking us about is 3 non-collinear points. Now this just means that one of your 3 points, one or more of your 3 points have to not be on the same line. So you could say T, U, and W, because T and U are on the same line, but W isn't. So these 3 points all together are non-collinear. A lot of students get stuck here because they're like, wait, T and U are on the same line, so they're collinear. So how can this be? Well, it has to be all 3 points on the same line, okay? So as long as one of them's not on the line, you're good to go. You also could say T, S, and W. There's a lot of options here. You could go on and on. As long as you have at least 1 point not on that line, it would be non-collinear, okay? So let's keep moving on to the next one. Next definition is going to be a segment, and a segment has 1 dimension. It's like a line, but notice that it has endpoints instead of arrows. And you can name this segment a couple of different ways. You could either name it segment AB, or you could name it segment BA. Both of these are correct. Now notice that it has to have the segment mark above it though. If it doesn't have the segment mark above it, I won't know it's a segment. So make sure you do put that there. But you can flip-flop however you want to do the letters here. Just like we did with the line, we could flip-flop the letters there too. The next thing we're going to talk about is array. And a lot of students mess this one up because of the specific order that you have to write array in. So it looks like a line mixed with a line segment. It has an endpoint and it has an arrow. So it's a little bit of both. You have to start with your endpoint and shoot through the arrow when you name this. So you always have to name it endpoint to arrow. Okay, I don't care which way this thing is pointing. Find the endpoint. And in our picture, what's our endpoint? A B. And in our picture, where does the arrow go? Through the A. So it has to look like this. If you told me AB, this is wrong because that's not where the endpoint and the arrow is. And I'll have some students that'll do this. They'll say, well, it's AB, but it's pointing that way. Well, you can't write it with the arrow pointing that way. I don't know why they do it that way, but that's just the way they do it, so we have to make sure we do it the exact same way. So you have to do endpoint to the arrow, endpoint to the arrow, whenever you do your ray notation. Down here, we're going to talk about drawing the figure. So it says, draw the figure, non-collinear points R, S, and T, and then draw ray RT, ray RS, and ray ST. And then down here, we have a couple true-false questions, and after that, we have a couple of questions about this crazy picture. So what I'm going to ask you to do is go ahead and finish this up and bring it into class, and when you bring this into class, we'll talk about it there. But do finish this up, bring it into class, because it will count and we will be checking it. All right, see you in class.